She had chosen the grey gown again, and the Duke of Oakhaven knew exactly why. From the shadow of the great marble pillar, where he stood apart from his own guests, Gawain watched Coventina of House Cavale slip along the edge of the ballroom, the way water slips along the edge of a stone, seeking always the lowest and least noticed place. The gown was the colour of ash and river fog, cut plainly, unadorned by so much as a ribbon, and she wore it the way another woman might wear a cloak of invisibility. That was the whole of its purpose. He had understood that about her for 8 years, and in 8 years he had never once told her that he saw her more clearly than he saw any jewelled creature in the room. He was 39 years old, master of the largest house and greatest title in the realm, feared by men who owed him money, and by mothers who wished their daughters to catch him, and he could not make his feet cross 40 feet of parquet to speak a single ordinary word to the one woman he had ever loved. The chandeliers of Oakhaven blazed with hundreds of beeswax candles, and their golden light fell across embroidered silk and shimmering satin, across bare shoulders and diamond hair combs, across the powdered and the perfumed. The light fell on Coventina too, but she had arranged herself so that it could never truly settle. She stood half behind Lady Merrow's chair where a companion belonged, her hands folded over her apron, her chin a little lowered, her dark brown hair pinned close without a single curl allowed to escape and betray her to the eye. A stranger passing through the court would have passed over her a dozen times and never have counted her among the company at all. She had made herself furniture. She had made herself the plain grey wall against which brighter women might shine. And Gawain, who could have commanded any brightness in the kingdom set before him for the asking, looked at the grey wall and felt the old, suffocating ache turn over in his chest like a living thing. "You are scowling at your own ball, brother," said a quiet voice at his elbow. Lady Honora had come up beside him with 2 crystal glasses she had no intention of surrendering. "The Duchess of Wrotham has already asked me whether you are unwell," Honora said. "I told her that you are always unwell in company. It is the only thing that keeps her daughters at a safe distance from your side." "Let them keep it," Gawain murmured. Honora followed the line of his gaze as she had followed it 100 times before, and her mouth softened in the way that always made him wish he had turned his head a half-second sooner. "You might ask her to dance," she said quietly. "It is your house. A hostess's companion, a courtesy of the host. It is done every night in 100 noble houses. It is not done in mine," Gawain said. "It is not done in yours," Honora agreed with a slow breath, "because you will not do it." 8 years, Gawain. Do you imagine I have not counted them as well?" He did not answer her. There was no answer that would survive being spoken aloud. Across the room, Lady Merrow lifted a withered, jewelled hand. Coventina bent at once to hear her. Whatever the demanding old woman wanted, a shawl, a fan, a name whispered so that she might greet a guest without the humiliation of forgetting it, Coventina supplied it smoothly, invisibly, the way she supplied everything. She was 24 now. She had been barely 16 when he first saw her, and even then she had been folding herself smaller than she was born to be. He remembered it the way a man remembers the hour his life divided into before and after. It had been a wet spring, his father newly dead, and Gawain freshly and unwillingly master of Oakhaven, riding the outer boundaries to learn the weight of what he now governed. He had come upon a tenant's stone cottage where the roof had caved in under the winter storms, and a fallen noble family sat wretched in the ruin of it. The Cavales had been lords of the western High Vales once, an ancient bloodline ruined by court factions and buried in debt, and among them, holding 2 weeping younger cousins against the biting cold and pretending she was not herself terrified, had been a girl in a grey dress 2 sizes too large. That girl, 16 and half drowned in rain, had looked up at the great mounted lord who had ridden into her ruin. Instead of dropping to the mud or begging for charity, she had lifted her chin, her spine straight as an iron blade, and said, "The children are hungry, my lord. I am not. Please do not trouble yourself for me." He had given orders that very day for the roof, for the debts, for coal and flour. He had done it, he told himself, because it was a sovereign's plain duty. He had gone on telling himself that, through every quiet arrangement he had made since, and he had never once persuaded himself of it for longer than an afternoon. "You have gone away again," Honora said softly. "To wherever it is you go." "I am here," Gawain said, And it was almost true. The music turned, and the dancers turned with it, and Lady Merrow's party rose to move nearer the hearth. Coventina moved with them, carrying the old woman's shawl over her arm as though she had been born to carry it. As she passed within 10 feet of him, close enough that he might have spoken, she did not raise her eyes. She never raised her eyes to him. She had learned that the master of Oakhaven was a man to be feared, cold and hard and sparing of speech, and that a companion in a grey gown did well to keep from his notice altogether. That was the cruelty of it, he thought. He had spent 8 years making certain she was safe, and every one of those years he had taught her without meaning to that he was a man she must hide from. He did not know that across the floor, Sir Julian Pruitt had been watching her too. Pruitt was a florid, prosperous knight of 50, a widower twice over, with a laugh too loud for the room and a way of looking at women that made Gowan's jaw tighten. Pruitt stared over Coventina with the frank, appraising slowness of a merchant pricing a horse. Gowan set down his glass. He saw Pruitt begin to move, drifting smoothly across the floor toward Lady Merrow's chair. It should not have mattered. It was not his place to guard a companion from a coarse man's glance. He had spent 8 years insisting she was not his, and yet he found that his boots had crossed half the width of the parquet before he had decided to move at all. Gowan placed himself quite naturally, quite unhurriedly, in the small space of floor between Sir Julian Pruitt and Lady Merrow's chair, a dark, immovable wall between the coarse man and the grey girl. "Miss Cavale," Gowan said, and his voice was quiet, and quietness in him was known to be more dangerous than another man's shouting, "is under the protection of this house tonight, as is every guest and companion beneath my roof. I am sure, Pruitt, that a man of your address requires no more explicit instruction than that." Pruitt's face went dark red. He bowed hastily and backed away into the crowd. And then Gowan turned, and found that Coventina of House Cavale was looking directly at him. Her eyes were grey like her gown, but not the flat grey of ash. They were the grey of the sky before it clears with light behind it. For 2 seconds, the length of a held breath, the length of 8 years, she stared full into his face. Her eyes asked the terrible unspoken question, "Why did you do that? Why do you know my name?" The ball ended as balls always did, in a long, echoing unravelling of carriage wheels, heavy wool cloaks, and murmured farewells. Gowan stood at the foot of his great sweeping staircase, making himself gracious to 200 departing nobles he had no wish to see. The whole time, some deep and traitorous part of him was counting the passing minutes until Lady Merrow's party should descend from the grand salon. They came near the last, as befitted an old woman, who moved slowly and enjoyed being waited upon. Lady Merrow leaned heavily upon Coventina's arm, complaining of the midnight draughts and the intolerable arrogance of the Rotham family. Coventina answered softly, soothing every grievance, her plain grey gown disappearing almost entirely into the shadows of the flickering sconces. She kept her eyes lowered. Whatever electric shock had passed between them across the ballroom parquet, she had folded it away with all the other things she did not permit herself to feel. But at the heavy oak doors, as Lady Merrow was helped up into her carriage amidst hot bricks and fur blankets, Coventina paused. For a brief, suspended heartbeat, she and the Duke were alone beneath the vast stone archway of Oakhaven. She turned and looked up at him deliberately, her chin lifted, and said in a voice so low no footman could catch the sound, "Thank you, Your Grace, for what you said to Sir Julian. It was not necessary, but it was kind." It was the first sentence she had spoken to him in 8 years that was not a required court civility. Gowan held it the way a man holds a fragile crystal glass that might shatter under the weight of his own fingers. "It was necessary," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "No woman beneath this roof should be spoken to as Pruitt spoke." "Companions are spoken to so a great deal, Your Grace," she replied. There was no bitterness in her tone, only the weary, quiet truth of a noblewoman who had learned what visibility cost in a world of wolves. One grows accustomed. "But it was kind of you to notice." "I notice a great deal," Gowan said, the words slipping out rougher and deeper than he had intended, "that I do not speak of." A flicker passed across her face, a sudden, searching light, quickly governed before Lady Merrow's shrill voice summoned her from the carriage window. Coventina offered a small, flawless curtsy and vanished into the cold night. Gowan retreated to the silence of his private library. The hearth had burned down to grey embers. He pulled open the heavy bottom drawer of his desk, where decades of confidential records lay sealed. Inside sat a thick bundle of parchment, dozens of letters written across 8 winters, each begun with her name and abandoned before the second line. Coventina, I have loved you since the day you told me you were not hungry. He had never posted a single one, to confess his love now. After 8 years of secretly funding her family, clearing her mother's debts, and securing her cousins' livelihoods through false benefactors, would not sound like devotion. It would sound like a sovereign claiming the harvest of a woman he had purchased in the dark. 3 days later, a summons arrived from Merrow Court. He found Lady Merrow wrapped in shawls before an oversized hearth, a sleeping spaniel in her lap. "Oakhaven," the old woman said sharply, fixing him with her bright, rheumy eyes. "Sir Julian Pruitt has written to me. He has made a formal offer of marriage for Coventina." A sudden, paralyzing cold settled into Gowan's chest. "He is wealthy," Lady Merrow continued briskly. "He is a knight with vast estates and no living children. He is willing to take a portionless companion of ruined bloodline and make her Lady Pruitt. I have told him I will put it to her. I shall counsel her to accept, because when I die, the girl will have nothing but £40 and a box of old books. A woman cannot eat her own pride, Oakhaven." She peered at him through the firelight. "I wish to know, Your Grace, whether you had any reason to bid me tell her otherwise." The room seemed to hold its breath. 8 years of silence rose between them like an iron gate. To say yes was to reveal the entire scaffold of his secret guardianship before he had given her the power to refuse him freely. "I have no reason," Gowan heard himself say, his voice like chipped stone, "that I am able to give you." He rode out of Merrow Court that afternoon with his cowardice heavy upon his shoulders. Unable to bear the walls of his palace, his stallion carried him along the outer boundary road until he reached the low, moss-covered walls of Street Aldwyn's churchyard. And there, standing alone among the leaning headstones with the autumn wind whipping her grey cloak, was Coventina. She was standing before the humble grave of the aunt who had raised her cousins. She was weeping not the polite tears of the court, but the raw, shuddering grief of someone who believed the entire world was looking away. The sound of his horse's hooves made her turn. In an instant, the iron armor of her composure came crashing down. She wiped her face swiftly, stepping back with a hurried curtsy. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I did not mean to trespass upon your parish." "You are not trespassing," Gowan said, dismounting and looping the reins over the gate. "Stay, please." He walked slowly across the damp grass, stopping a respectful distance from the headstone. "Your aunt?" "Yes," Coventina murmured, her voice steadying with immense effort. "When she died 8 years ago, I thought we would all be cast into the workhouse, but then a miracle arrived. A letter from a solicitor named Halloway. A distant, unnamed connection had settled an annuity for my keep and provided for my cousins." She shook her head, looking down at the cold earth. "For 8 years, someone has held us up out of the dark. I used to lie awake, wondering who my shadow benefactor was, grieving that I could never thank him. But one cannot build a life around a shadow whose face one will never see." Every word struck Gowan like a hammer against an anvil. He had built her a sanctuary, and she had spent 8 years mourning that it had no human face. "Lady Merrow told me this morning of Sir Julian's offer," Coventina said quietly, staring into the grey sky. "She counsels me to accept, and she is right. But I do not love him. He looks at me as though pricing cattle. If I marry him, I shall be his furniture forever, with no half-day, no grave to visit, and no hour of my life that belongs to me." She looked at Gowan, her grey eyes filled with a desperate, bewildered light. "Forgive me. I do not know why I tell you this. You are the only person who has ever spoken to me as if I were a human being, and not a shadow." Gowan took a step forward, his chest heaving with the weight of the truth. "Do not accept him yet," Gowan said, his voice fierce and low. "Ask Lady Merrow for a fortnight. Promise me you will take 14 days before you speak your answer." "Why?" she whispered, searching his intense, shadowed face. "Why should a duke care whether a companion takes a day or a fortnight?" Because a decision made in terror is never free, Gowan said, holding her gaze until the wind died between them. Give me 14 days. That is all I ask. The fortnight that followed became for the Duke of Oakhaven the most astonishing 14 days of his life, because for the first time in 8 years, he stopped hiding. He did not speak the truth, not yet. The courage for that arrived only in slow, agonizing inches, but he completely dismantled the architecture of his absence. He rode to Merrow openly, under the perfectly respectable guise of a neighboring nobleman paying his courtesies to his late mother's oldest acquaintance, and when Lady Merrow predictably dozed in her velvet armchair by the roaring hearth, her small spaniel snoring softly upon her knees, Gowan sat across the low table and talked with Coventina of House Cavell as no one in the realm had troubled to talk with her in nearly a decade. He discovered that when the crushing arithmetic of daily survival was lifted, she was not grey at all. She possessed a dry, luminous wit and a keen, penetrating mind. She had quietly devoured half the volumes in Lady Merrow's neglected library, harbouring sharp, brilliant opinions on history, statecraft, and poetry. On the fourth afternoon, over a carved ebony chessboard he had brought from his own study, she argued with him over a passage of classical philosophy with such fierce, unyielding intellect that Gowan laughed aloud, a deep, unburdened sound that startled the servants lingering in the corridor. You laugh quite differently than the court led me to believe, Coventina said, her fingers resting lightly upon a carved knight. At your state balls, the county whispers that your grace possesses a heart fashioned of cold river stone. They say a great many things of me, Gowan replied, studying the board with feigned concentration, most of which I have actively encouraged. It is remarkably convenient to be feared. It keeps ambitious mothers and scheming counsellors at a comfortable distance. And what keeps me at a distance? She asked. The question slipped out with playful ease, but the instant the words hung in the air, a faint rose colour flushed her cheeks. She looked down at the board, her lashes casting long shadows upon her pale skin. Forgive me, Your Grace. I forget myself in your presence. I have no right to speak so boldly to the Master of Oakhaven. You do not forget yourself, Coventina, Gowan said, his voice dropping into that quiet, absolute gravity that always commanded her stillness. You remember yourself. It is an entirely different thing. You have spent 8 years making yourself small and colourless so the world would pass you by. What you call forgetting yourself is simply the noblewoman you were always meant to be. She remained silent for a long, breathless moment, her fingers tightening around the captured piece. That is an extraordinary thing to say to an unpaid companion across a chessboard. I am well aware of it, Gowan whispered. Checkmate in 3 moves, I believe. It is not, she countered, lifting her chin with that old, breathtaking defiance that had captured him in the rain 8 years ago. And you are a scoundrel to attempt such a bluff. On the 7th afternoon, the exact midpoint of the fortnight, the autumn fog parted, leaving the sky clear and crystalline. Lady Merrow, who loathed the outdoor chill and welcomed being rid of both her restless companion and the imposing Duke, commanded them to walk the grounds. They walked along the neglected gravel paths between untrimmed boxwood hedges. The silence between them was no longer the frozen, terrified quiet of master and servant, but something delicate, resonant, and entirely new. May I ask you a question, Your Grace? Coventina asked softly, her grey wool sleeve brushing within an inch of his black wool coat. One that I have no rightful business asking? You may ask me anything in this world, Gowan replied. Why have you never taken a wife? She kept her eyes fixed upon the gravel path, but her voice was steady. You are the sovereign lord of this province. There is not a great house in the kingdom that would not lay its finest daughter at your feet. Yet you stand against your marble pillars year after year, freezing the court in silence. I used to believe the rumors that you despised all company, but watching you across the chessboard this week, I do not believe you are a man who wishes to be alone. I think you are a man who loves someone deeply, yet refuses to reach for her. Gowan's boots crunched against the stone. His heart hammered against his ribs like an iron bell. It is you. It has always been you since the rain-soaked cottage in the valley. The confession surged into his throat, but the sight of her searching, unguarded face held him back. To declare his passion now, before she had formally refused Sir Julian Pruitt of her own free will, would be to cast the crushing weight of a duke's power over a decision that belonged to her soul alone. "There was someone," Gowan said slowly, choosing every syllable with painful care. "Many winters ago, I was proud, and she was vulnerable, and circumstances were such that I could not speak without compromising her standing. By the time I possessed the freedom to speak, I had built a wall of silence so vast that I feared reaching over it would only terrify her." Coventina stopped walking. She turned to face him, the autumn wind tugging at the loose curls near her temples. "Is she married now, this lady?" "No," Gowan said. "She is not." "Then it is not too late," she said, her grey eyes widening with sudden, earnest warmth. "Surely if she is free, a man of your honor may still step forward and speak the truth." "It may be very much too late," Gowan murmured, his gaze holding hers with unbearable intensity. "Because in my cowardice, I performed kindnesses from the shadows. I hid behind dead names and silent arrangements, believing I was keeping her safe. And I dread that if she learns the full truth of what I have done, she will not see love in it. She will see only a great lord who governed her destiny without her consent." Coventina went entirely still. The air between them grew so taut that the rustling leaves seemed deafening. Her lips parted, and for one terrifying, magnificent second, Gowan was certain she had understood the riddle. She stood on the absolute threshold of the truth. Then, the shrill, demanding voice of Lady Merrow echoed from the manor window, calling for her shawl and her dropped book. The spell shattered. Coventina stepped back, dropping her eyes in haste. "I must go in," she frets when left alone. "Good day, Your Grace." She hurried up the stone steps, leaving Gowan standing alone in the dying light, cursing the old woman, cursing his own restraint, and entirely unaware that while they walked, Sir Julian Pruitt's confidential clerk was already turning over the confidential ledgers in the town registry. Sir Julian Pruitt was not a man built for patient waiting, and he found the concept of a companion requiring a fortnight utterly intolerable. To a man whose life was measured in ledgers, rents, and mortgages, an impoverished noblewoman should have fallen to her knees in weeping gratitude at the very mention of his title. When rumours reached his ears that the Duke of Oakhaven had been seen riding down the gravel avenue of Merrow Court 4 times in 7 days, Pruitt's crude mind did what vulgar minds always do. It calculated appetite. He set his private attorney to comb through the county records, plying town clerks with gold. Valenmere kept its secrets tightly, but 8 years of annuities, school fees, and roof repairs left faint ink upon old parchments. Within days, the attorney uncovered the link. The very barrister who managed the Duke's confidential estates was the same man who had quietly disbursed the funds for the Cavale family's survival. It was not legal proof of dishonor, but in the hands of a man like Pruitt, it was a lethal weapon. He arrived at Merrow Court on the 11th afternoon of the fortnight. He did not ask for Lady Merrow. He demanded to see Miss Cavale in the cold, damp morning room. Gowan learned of that interview 3 hours later, in the worst manner imaginable. Night had fallen over Oakhaven, bringing with it a driving, icy autumn rain. The palace porter, bewildered and alarmed, summoned Lady Honora, who immediately ran to the library where Gowan sat, staring into the hearth. "Gowan," Honora whispered, her face pale in the doorway. "You must come to the small drawing-room at once. She is here." Gowan entered the room to find Coventina standing rigid before the dying fire. Her grey cloak was soaked through with rain, clinging heavily to her trembling shoulders. Her dark hair was plastered to her temples, and her face was drained of every drop of blood. She had walked 3 miles through the dark and mud alone. "Is it true?" she asked. There was no curtsy, no formal greeting. Her voice was terrifyingly level, the brittle, dangerous calm of a soul holding itself together by sheer willpower. "Sir Julian Pruitt came to me today," she continued, her grey eyes locking onto his with shattering force. "He told me a monstrous thing, Your Grace, and I have walked in the storm because I must hear from your own lips whether it is a lie. Is it true that there was never any distant cousin in Bath? Is it true that the unseen benefactor who paid my mother's debts, settled my cousins, and placed me behind an old woman's chair, was you?" Honora stepped backward out of the room, closing the heavy oak door with a quiet, final click. The wood in the hearth cracked. 8 long years of silence stood in the room, stripped bare of all defense. "Yes," Gowan said, his voice dropping into the quiet of a ruined chapel. "It is true." He watched the words strike her like a physical blow. She did not cry out. She did not weep. Instead, a cold, defensive horror washed over her features, the devastating look of a woman who has realized the floor beneath her feet was never her own. 8 years, she whispered, her voice tightening like a drawn bowstring. The roof over our heads, James's schooling, the clothes on my back, all of it. You, Coventina. And you never told me. The cry broke from her throat, raw and fractured. I stood beside my aunt's grave not 10 days ago and told you how I grieved that my benefactor had no face. I told you I could build no gratitude around a shadow. You had every reason on earth to speak, and you stood there in your great coat and let me weep for a ghost. Why? What did you want from me that you could not ask for aloud? Did you intend to buy me a shilling at a time until I had no breath left that did not belong to you? The exact nightmare he had dreaded for 8 winters had arrived, made 1,000 times more poisonous by his silence. That is what Pruitt told you, Gowan said, his heart tearing open. He told you the Duke of Oakhaven kept you as a dependent in plain dress so he might have you near, helpless and grateful. Her silence was a dagger to his chest. And you believed him, Gowan said hoarsely. What else was I to believe? She cried, pressing her shaking hand to her mouth. Men of your rank do not spend fortunes on impoverished companions out of pure benevolence. Pruitt told me he would still take me as his wife, but only as damaged goods at a discount, provided I was grateful for his mercy. Because of you, because you turned my entire life into a secret scandal without my knowledge. I thought I was invisible. And all the while I was the most watched, bought creature in the province. Gowan crossed the distance between them. He did not touch her, he had no right, but he stood so close she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. I never wanted anything from you, Coventina, he said, and for the first time in his life, his voice cracked with absolute surrender. Not gratitude, not your hand, not your submission. I wanted you warm. I wanted you fed. I wanted the workhouse kept from your kin and a roof over your head that no man could tear down, and I did it because I have loved you since the rainy day you lifted your chin in a ruined cottage and told me you were not hungry when you were starving. He stared down into her stunned, wide eyes. I hid behind false names because I could not bear that you should ever feel the horror you are feeling tonight. I stayed silent to keep you free, and I see now that my cowardice only built you a finer prison, leaving you defenseless when a scoundrel came to name my devotion a purchase. Coventina backed toward the door, her chest heaving, her eyes wild with agony and profound confusion. I do not know you, she choked out. I thought you were the only man who saw me as a person, and you were the shadow all along. I cannot be under your roof. Coventina, wait. Do not say my name, she sobbed. I do not know what to do with it. She turned, pulled the heavy door open, and fled out into the pouring rain before anyone could stop her. Gowan did not pursue her into the tempest that night, though every muscle in his body strained against the command. Instead, he made Honora dispatch a trusted mounted groom to follow at a discreet distance through the mud, ensuring only that Coventina reached the gates of Merrow Court unharmed. It was one final, bitter piece of unseen protection, and Gowan despised himself for it. Yet he would rather she arrived safely and cursed his memory than perish in the dark, believing she had finally escaped his reach. When the groom returned at midnight to confirm she was inside, Gowan retreated to his vast, echoing library. He sat before the cold hearth until dawn. The bottom drawer of his mahogany desk remained pulled wide, its contents laid bare like the bones of an unholy past. For the first time in 8 years, he did not add another unfinished fragment to the bundle. The entire hoard was spent. The secret was dead, leaving only ruin in its wake. The Duke of Oakhaven was a man who had mastered the high politics of the kingdom. He knew how to break a rebellious baron with a single signature, how to govern vast estates, and how to command the respect of an empire, but he had no notion of how to make a woman believe she was cherished when his silence had spent 8 years convincing her she was merely owned. Honora found him there at 8 in the morning, unshaven and hollow-eyed. She did not offer empty platitudes. She sat opposite the cold hearth and spoke with the unsparing clarity only a sister possessed. "You did not lose her last night, Gowan," Honora said firmly. "You have been losing her a fraction of an inch every day for 8 years by keeping her in ignorance. Last night, the loss merely became visible. You handed her an entire decade of your heart in 10 brutal minutes, with Pruitt's venom still ringing in her ears, and expected her to separate love from a ledger before the fire died. No woman alive could do that." Gowan buried his face in his hands. "She heard a purchase, Honora. She heard a lord collecting an investment." "Then prove to her that she is free," Honora replied, rising to stand beside the desk. "Finish the long letter you began. Set down every cowardly reason, every unspoken winter, every anonymous shilling. Do not write it to demand her pardon, but to give her the truth in a form she can hold in her own hands. And then, Gowan, give her the means to walk away from you forever." Gowan looked up, his jaw set. "And if she chooses to walk away, then you will have loved her honorably at last," Honora said softly. "Which is far more than you achieved in 8 years of hiding behind stone pillars." Gowan took up his quill. It took him the whole of that day and the long watches of the following night. It was the most grueling endeavor of his life, because it required the absolute dismantling of his own pride. He detailed everything. He wrote of the wet spring and the collapsed thatch roof, of the proud 16-year-old girl who would not beg, and of how his sovereign duty had turned instantly into an obsession he was too terrified to name. He wrote of the dead woman's name he had invented to funnel his gold, of the hours spent standing against marble pillars at balls simply to watch the hem of her grey skirt, and of the drawer of unsent letters that had grown thick with his cowardice. He laid bare the agony of the churchyard, where he had swallowed the confession on his tongue because he could not bear to force her hand, and at the very end, beneath the weight of 8 years of truth, he wrote the lines that had never survived his ink before. "I have loved you since the day you told me you were not hungry. That is the whole of my crime, and it asks nothing in return. Enclosed with this accounting are the legal deeds executed by Mr. Halloway. The estate and revenues are settled upon you irrevocably, in your own name, under royal seal. No man may ever touch them, not Sir Julian Pruitt, not Lady Merrow's heirs, and least of all myself. Go to the capital, go to the continent, or remain where you are. Marry whom you choose, or live entirely alone. I will never cross your path again, unless you summon me. And if you never send for me, know only this, that for 8 years, a man counted it the greatest honor of his life, merely that you were warm, fed, and breathing beneath the same sky. He summoned Halloway, his oldest and most discreet barrister. "Take this packet to Miss Cavale at Merrow Court," Gowan commanded, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Place it directly into her hands. Tell her she may read it at her leisure, that the settlement is absolute and unconditional, and that no answer is expected or required." Halloway departed with the sealed parchment. When the barrister returned hours later, he reported that Miss Cavale had received the packet in absolute silence, turning bone white as she touched the royal wax seal. She had asked only once whether the inheritance was truly hers without debt or obligation, and upon hearing it confirmed, had clutched the heavy envelope against her breast, as though it were either infinitely precious or unbearably heavy. And then the silence began. Gowan held to his word with iron discipline. He did not ride down the lane to Merrow Court. He sent no messengers, and he allowed no grooms to linger near her village. He had given her absolute liberty, and he would rather die of the quiet than make a liar of himself by hovering over the cage he had just unlocked. For 4 endless days, he walked the empty corridors of Oakhaven. On the 5th morning, unable to bear the library any longer, he rode his horse back to the ruined cottage on the estate boundary where it had all begun. He sat upon his mount in the grey dawn light, looking at the weathered stones and the overgrown garden, and whispered into the cold wind, "I would do every kindness again. I only wish I had possessed the courage to sign my name." At Merrow Court, behind the frosted glass of her tiny, draughty room beneath the eaves, Coventina read the Duke's letter by the light of a single tallow candle. She read it once through very quickly, her heart racing against her ribs like a trapped bird. She read it a second time slowly, lingering over every line of ink, every date, every unvarnished confession of fear. And then, as the clock struck 3 in the dead of night, she read it a third time, pressing her trembling hand hard against her mouth to stifle the weeping that rose from the very depths of her soul. Somewhere during that third reading, the cold, defensive arithmetic of a dependent woman vanished from her eyes forever. She walked to the narrow window and looked out over the dark fields toward Oakhaven. She thought of the ruined cottage 8 years ago, of the mounted lord who had looked upon a starving girl and taken the weight of her entire family upon his shoulders without demanding a single whispered word of thanks. She thought of the ebony chessboard, of the man whose deep laugh had echoed through Lady Merrow's drawing-room, and of the quiet, agonized truth he had spoken in the garden. I feared that the very kindness would be turned against me and called by an uglier name. She had read countless romantic tales in the manor library where lovers swore oaths, made grand demands, and insisted upon possession. Not one of them had ever written what Gowan had written, "You owe me nothing." And that is the whole point, and always was. A man who buys a woman makes certain she feels the crushing weight of her obligation. But the master of Oakhaven had spent 8 long years, at immense peril to his own heart, ensuring she owed him nothing at all. He had given her a fortress of gold and law, and then handed her the key to walk out of his province forever. When dawn broke over the frost-covered hills, Coventina Kaival knew with absolute certainty that she would rather die than marry Sir Julian Pruitt. She met Pruitt in the entrance hall that very morning. The portly knight had arrived expecting a weeping, submissive capitulation. Instead, he found a noble woman in a plain grey gown, whose spine was as unyielding as tempered steel. "I thank you for the honor of your offer, Sir Julian," Coventina said, her voice echoing clearly off the stone walls. "And I refuse it entirely, now and for all time. Furthermore, I must ask that you never again repeat the slanderous lies you spoke regarding the Duke of Oakhaven. A true gentleman does not spread poison about a noble benefactor simply because a lady has chosen not to have him." Pruitt turned purple with rage, muttering crude threats of her impending ruin when Lady Merrow should pass. Coventina merely looked at him with cool, unbothered pity. "I shall not be ruined, Sir Julian," she said softly. "For the first time in 8 years, I am no longer afraid of the light." She left him standing in the draught and went straight to Lady Merrow's drawing-room, laying bare the entire history, the secret annuity, the unsent letters, the deeds of settlement, and the 8 years of silent devotion. The old woman listened in stunned silence, her dry, ringed hand tightening around Coventina's fingers. 8 years, Lady Merrow whispered, her voice wavering with rare emotion. That grave, proud, awkward boy. When a man loves you so deeply that he would rather see you walk away free than keep you bound by gratitude, Coventina, you do not let him remain in the dark. He has spent 8 years hiding behind other men's names. Go and force him to stand in the open at last. The opportunity arrived 3 days later, with the grandest invitation of the season. The great autumn ball at the Rotham estate, where every peer and noble house in 3 provinces would gather. Coventina did not use Gowan's settlement to hire a post-chaise for the capital. Instead, she called upon the finest dressmaker in the market town. For the first time in her life, she did not ask for grey wool or plain linen. She chose a gown of rich, glowing rose silk, deep and warm as autumn embers, impeccably tailored to her slender frame, with a neckline that framed the proud line of her throat. And from a small jeweller's shop, with the very first gold coins that were undeniably her own, she purchased a single string of lustrous white pearls. On the night of the Rotham ball, Gowan stood beside his customary marble pillar, having been dragged to the gathering by Honora to quell the county's whispers. He wore black velvet, his face carved of stone, his eyes resolutely turned away from the grand entrance. He believed she had taken her fortune and fled. He believed he had done his duty and lost his heart forever. Then, a sudden, electric hush rippled through the 200 assembled guests. The conversation died mid-sentence. Fans ceased to flutter. The violinists faltered. Gowan turned slowly, indifferent to whatever spectacle had captured the court's attention, and felt his breath tear from his lungs. Standing in the grand archway of the ballroom was Coventina of House Cavale. She was not in grey. She was not folded away. She stood bathed in the golden blaze of the crystal chandeliers, radiant in rich rose silk, with delicate dark curls framing her luminous face and a single strand of pearls glowing at her throat. Her chin was lifted high, her grey eyes clear, fierce, and shining with an unmasked light. She had not come to hide behind a chair. She had come to be seen by the only man who mattered. The silence inside the Rotham ballroom was absolute, heavy with the stunned disbelief of 200 noblemen and duchesses who had spent nearly a decade ignoring the companion in grey. Gawain could not move. 8 years of stone and restraint held his boots rooted to the parquet beside his pillar. So Coventina crossed the room to him. She walked the entire length of the grand gallery herself, a noble woman without an army, carrying no weapon but her restored dignity, dressed in shimmering rose silk that caught the warm light of every chandelier. The sea of velvet coats and diamond-studded gowns parted before her in stunned awe. She did not falter, and she did not lower her gaze. Not once in all that long crossing did she look away from the dark, imposing duke who had watched over her from the shadows. She stopped directly before him, closer than any dependent had ever dared stand to the master of Oakhaven. In the breathless hush of the watching court, she spoke clearly, her voice ringing across the vast hall so that no whisper could ever distort the truth again. I have come to thank my benefactor to his face, before the entire realm. Since he was never brave enough to let me thank him in the dark, I see no reason why he should be spared the public light. A collective gasp swept through the assembled nobility, but Gawain heard none of it. He saw only the luminous grey of her eyes, shining with tears she refused to hide. "Coventina," he whispered, his voice trembling for the first time in his life. "You are free. You did not have to come." "I know it," she replied, her chin lifted in that proud, unforgettable defiance. "That is the only reason I am here. You gave me the power to walk away from you forever, Gawain, and because you gave me that freedom, I finally understood that you never wished to own me. A man who buys a woman does not hand her the deed to her own life. Only a man who loves her does that." She took a breath that shook her slender frame, but her voice never wavered. "You wrote in your letter that you have loved me since the day I told you I was not hungry. I was starving, Gawain. I have been starving for 8 winters, not for bread, but for someone to look upon me, to see my true name, and to say it aloud. And the entire time, the most feared man in the province saw me more clearly than anyone ever has, yet kept silent because he feared frightening me." She reached up, her gloved fingers touching the single strand of pearls at her throat. "I did not spend your settlement on a carriage out of Valenmere. I spent it on this gown and these pearls, so that for once in my life, I might stand in the open without fear. I love you, Gawain. I have loved you since the churchyard. So here I am, in the center of the largest hall in the county, telling you so where there is no pillar left to hide behind. 8 years is enough. Come out of the dark." The master of Oakhaven, who had faced rebellions, outfaced treason, and governed an empire with a heart of iron, felt the last wall of his restraint crumble into dust. He sank to one knee upon the polished parquet. Before his peers, before the whispering duchesses, before Sir Julian Pruitt, whose face had turned the colour of lead, Duke Gawain took both of Coventina's hands in his own. He bowed his dark head and pressed his mouth to her trembling fingers in an act of absolute, public homage. "Then I am out of it," he murmured against her skin, rising to draw her into his arms where the entire kingdom could see. "God help me, Coventina. I am out of the dark, and I will never let a shadow stand between us again. I will say your name every day of my life until the realm forgets how to whisper." And there, beneath the blazing chandeliers, with the court looking on in reverent silence, the feared ruler of Oakhaven danced with the woman in rose silk, who would never be invisible again. They were married the following spring, at the low grey stone church of Street Aldwyn. The plain headstone in the churchyard that once bore only the name of Coventina's aunt had been replaced by a monument of white marble, inscribed with words of royal gratitude bearing Gawain's own seal. Coventina wore the simple string of pearls she had bought with her first taste of freedom, refusing the diamond tiaras of the palace until she took her rightful seat as Duchess of the Western Valenmere. In the years that followed, the Grand Library at Oakhaven became the warmest room in the palace. The heavy-bottomed drawer that had once held dozens of unsent confessions was kept empty, replaced by laughter, shared books, and evenings over the ebony chessboard. And every year, on the anniversary of the Rotham Ball, Gowan would find his wife wherever she was in the great manor, sometimes across the long gallery, sometimes merely across the hearth, and he would deliberately walk the distance to her side. When he reached her, Coventina would smile, her grey eyes filled with light, and say, "There you are. You took your time." And Gowan would take her hand, press it to his heart, and answer, "8 years too long, never again."